Ladies and gentlemen, let's get ready for the Wot Supp podcast. With your host, Stu OG Industry Shannon and Will Warren Davey, new school formulator extraordinaire. We're talking all things supplements with insiders, athletes, experts, and more. So sit back, relax, and prepare to find out what's up.
Good morning. Welcome to episode 23 of the Wot Supp podcast. Today, we are lucky enough to have founder of Flex Success, Dean McKillop, on board, along with our usual faithful co-host. Say good morning, Stu.
Hey guys, thanks for listening in. And Dean, thanks for coming on, mate. It's an absolute pleasure. Really looking forward to picking your brains, mate.
Let's see where this goes. I will throw in a quick clarity. Co-founder of Flex, actually. Yeah.
We got Coach Lizzie as well. I was actually considering having both on, but I thought 4 people on a podcast might be a little bit fun. But I think
you could have always given me the subtle hint and kicked me off.
They could do a Flex takeover. Really, we could just have the day off. Look, the reason I was so keen to invite you, Dean, obviously we've crossed paths in an earlier life in some differing roles, but I think in recent times, what you've sort of founded with Flex has been sort of helping people change their headspace and their changing the lens that they view fitness, and particularly in the comp prep space and what that has to look like. And I've really enjoyed some of the content. If anyone follows the page, you'll see some really cool stuff, like just challenging thought processes, like you have to grind it out, you have to work hard, you have to grind yourself into the dirt to come in shape, and these sort of it's often misnomers. So I thought I'd start out by asking sort of when you started Flex, was it with the purpose of trying to dispel some common sort of fitness industry myths, or trying to educate people that there's a different way of doing things, or was it more you just were really passionate about trying to get your hands on coaching people directly?
Well, I'll let you know, like my background's in supplements as well, right? Like I worked at Nutritional Warehouse for 8 years, and quick little funny side shoot, Stu. I'm pretty sure I bought that book from you while working for Nutritional Warehouse.
Yeah, I think so, mate. Because I'm the national distributor of that book, so you would have had to have bought it off me.
Yep. It was just a funny. I was thinking the other day, I'm pretty sure I bought that from Stu. Flex was kind of founded out of necessity, I suppose, and that like lots of people kept asking me for additional support outside of the store, and then also online. Like I was a brat, I'd go around. Find people online that I didn't like their opinions of and tell them they were wrong instead of asking the appropriate questions, right? And I was a brat, and that kind of got attention from a point in time, sometimes good attention, sometimes bad attention. And then Liz just said to me one day, like, I work in the gyms. I get asked all the time for additional support outside of the gyms. I can't provide that. You do it too. And we see a big gap in the market whereby there's people that are very dogmatic in their belief systems around food specifically. And we don't think it's fair for them to have to live their lives in such a restricted manner. So like, why don't we offer it? And I went, because I was sending people at the time to Denver Stain a lot, and to people that are still in the industry actually, which is quite cool, that are still doing very well. And then I was like, I guess I can do it. So why not? And then we launched it, and it was supposed to be a bit of a hobby job, but it just kind of took off and cost me more time than I expected.
It's true sometimes that, am I coming up on your speaker view, guys, when I'm talking? Is the picture of me coming up on the screen? Because I'm not getting the highlight around myself. All right, no worries. See, on my screen, we've got Dean still highlighted. But I guess if you're watching this via YouTube, you'll know that I'm on the screen at the moment. If not, so be it. You'll just have to listen to my voice.
I changed mine to gallery, so all 3 of us are on at once.
Oh, okay, no worries. That's probably not a bad idea. Anyways, so your side hustle, sometimes it doesn't start out as your I guess your ultimate goal to be just doing that, but it tends to work out that way when we're doing something that we're passionate about. The success and the money and the growth, they just seem to come without effort when you're really enjoying something that you're doing, when you're passionate about it, and when you obviously got a good knowledge in it as well. Is that kind of how it worked for Flex?
100%, dude. And like the other thing about like a passion job, like you said, or a passion project, is that you typically do it for the purpose of like good moral decisions and ethical decisions, and it's not to make money. And Flex has never been about trying to make money. It's always made money because we've done a very good job. And funnily enough, I used to actually pull, like when we have coaches that work for us, it's always been the same mention that I used to have as the area manager at NW. It's like, People come to the store not because we're necessarily the best or because we have the best prices, because we give really good customer service and people like you as a person. So like, just do good at being good, you know? And we kind of just always built the business around that motto, and it's just worked because we've tried to do it the right way, I think.
I think one of my favorite pieces of content that you guys have produced, and I think it's been really nice to see actually, as you've obviously had more people come on to help take the reins a little bit. You've obviously had the space to actually produce more content with you and Liz. It is the one that I liked was the life after dieting concept, and I think that's a really interesting space because I actually myself have found this an interesting one to navigate. And I think a lot of our listeners are people who compete regularly, store owners, supplement store retailers, people who live and breathe this. They track calories, they weigh their food, and there's not really an alternative in
There's no exit strategy at all.
There isn't at all. Because why? Because they're like, to us, I guess you get the entry strategy and then you just assume that's what you do. It's just like, oh, okay, well, if you want to try and achieve XYZ body composition, you need to account for XYZ macronutrients. To account for those, you need to actually track them or in some way. And I think intuitive eating got bashed a lot in earlier years as well after a while because people put a lot of just basically, again, more people in the calorie camp. So I guess looking at what does that look like as when you were saying exit strategy, what in your world does an idealistic, I guess people in our space, their lifestyle look like in nutrition sense? Like, are you guys advocates of, when if we're not in a specific goal, we should be eating just intuitively with a mindful approach, or what's your sort of approach to what it should look like in a long term?
Well, the language that you're choosing to use is interesting language because it's actually the reason in which we came about life after dieting. And that is that there's a space for people to learn about tracking macros to achieve a particular goal, whether that be a body composition goal or just to learn about food, right? Now, you could track forever, theoretically, but you probably shouldn't have to. Intuitive eating, like the trademark version of it, is a form of eating whereby it's weight neutral. So the goal isn't actually to manage or manipulate weight. It's to get you more in tune with your body so that you can learn to eat in a way that's not going to limit your potential to have a healthy and fulfilling life. So it's more about teaching the people about how to look at their cues within their system, understand hunger, understand satiety, manage food in a non-measurable, non-weight specific manner, right? And then a lot of people try to pull that intuitive eating into our space and say, oh, you can eat intuitively and also lose weight. So well, actually, no, that's a misappropriation of the intention of that process. Like, intuitive eating is actually a framework. There's a huge, huge, huge framework to intuitive eating. And it's outside of my scope of practice because it's not something that I've really learned enough to know, right?
Well, I guess what you say there sort of comes back a little bit to, our most common mindset, I guess, is we lose weight to be healthy, but really it should work the other way around, where it's like, if you're healthy, you shouldn't have to worry about your weight too much. It's going to take care of itself, provided your lifestyle and your eating habits are healthy. Then really, you're not going to have to be a slave to the scale and to your body fat percentage and all this sort of thing, right? So instead of losing weight to get healthy, let's get healthy to lose weight.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Like, health-seeking behavior should essentially result in a healthier individual. The question then is like, what is truly healthy? And that, again, is a massive framework of things we have to consider, like there's social health, psychological health, spiritual health, physical health, you name, the list goes on. Mac Nutrition in the UK actually have an awesome framework for what is healthy. But anyway, so yeah, we moved in this space where, like, if you take the PT industry is essentially centered around training individuals, and you can train an individual for their entire life. There's always a way to improve training and that person still be somewhat reliant on you, but learn. In our space is to get you to achieve a particular goal physically, or even, psychologically and socially, where you can eat food and not feel guilty and all the rest of it, but then like move you on to life. And unfortunately, that space has got about a 5% success rate in regards to the weight loss to weight maintained in future life. It's really bad, right?
It is. Lane Norton did heaps in this particular, like tracking people in long term. Like he just had some. We know he didn't do. He did some of the papers, but a lot of a meta analysis around people's long term rebounds. And sort of return to pre-dieting weights. And you're right, it literally was 90 to 95%. In a lot of cases, were rebounding to even higher than their pre-dieting weight. So they'd go from a starting point, diet down and then end up higher than they'd started in the first place, worse off than they had begun previous to the diet. And yeah, it's a really interesting space that doesn't get talked about much.
Yeah, and I think that happens because there's a lot of misinformation about how you need to get to the target weight, and then also how do you maintain that. So that ebook that we wrote, Life After Dieting, was centered around trying to take a couple of these concepts and make it something that is manageable and sort of suitable for that individual. So we coined this term informed eating. And informed eating is essentially like an amalgamation of all of these ideas, whereby there's mindful practice in your consumption of food at times. There's a learning period at the beginning, where you have to learn about food so that you can learn how to track and you understand what's in it. You have to understand what your personal goals are so that you can then at least measure your life to associate with those. And we have these sort of pillars of informed eating where people then start to learn the framework of that so they can then start to become a little bit more malleable to their lifestyles once they've achieved a certain goal. So it's never to have an individual count forever, but rather to potentially use counting in the early phases so that they can understand nutrition and what's in food. And then they can slowly digress and move from that. And then maybe use a combination of both, depending on what the typical goal is. And then teaching them what maintenance truly is. Like maintenance isn't staying 62.2 kilos 7 days of the week. Maintenance might be, again, like a range. And then how can we use informed eating practices, which is a non-counting approach, but having some mindful ideas of what food is, to manage your lifestyle so it's not so fucking difficult.
Yeah, it's so interesting that you say that as well, because the amount of customers and clients that I speak to that say to me, "Oh, Stu, what do your macros look like?" I haven't competed for 3 years, and I say, "Look, I don't track macros." But in saying that, I could look at a food and give you a pretty good estimate as to the macros, as to the the calories contained within that food, but I don't have to think about it anymore. I kind of know roughly what I'm eating each day. I know if I've blown out a little bit, and I just keep things in check. And I think that, like you said, for me though, that learning process came from the rigidness and strictness of needing to understand the numbers and needing to track macros for a long time, and initially having to use an app for it and punch it in, or so that learning process is huge. I wanted to rewind back a little bit though to I guess coming out of the prep. And I don't know if this is a misconception or not, but the trend to me seems to be that don't get me wrong, I've seen some men come out of prep horribly, but it seems like women more so than men struggle with this post-prep phase. And I've seen girls compete once, blow out, get overweight, and never compete again, and spend the next 4 or 5 years overweight. It seems to be women that maybe struggle slightly more with this than men.
I think it's because they unfortunately have less room for error from a caloric to body weight perspective. And you got to think about most girls that are involved in the bodybuilding industry are involved with other bodybuilding individuals, including larger humans, being men, and they're subjected to seeing what dudes can do and hoping that they can do the same. They may not actually be consciously doing that, but if you go out and eat a meal with somebody else who's eating the same amount, more than what you can afford to eat, and you're in a state of starvation whereby you're just seeking fleeting happiness, you'll match that person gram for gram because you don't have those signals set up to basically tell you to stop, right? But the biggest problem is, in the prep industry, people in prep, the goal of a prep coach theoretically is to get that person peeled on stage. And that can come at any cost. And nobody sees the underlying problems created from that coach's approach. They just see a person who's shredded on stage and they go, that coach is fucking awesome. It's like, yeah, but what about afterwards? So our next passion project, which we've started, is to do a post-comp recovery approach. And that'll be sort of a course-esque, semi-private, I don't use my language correctly here, sort of approach to get people out of comp in a safe and manageable manner so they aren't those people, because comp prep's not a healthy thing, but it doesn't mean that it has to be as unhealthy as possible.
Well, that's what I've always said to, when talking to my partner about comp prep or whoever it is, on stage, you look like the peak of physical health and fitness, but in actual fact, a 6-year-old girl could probably beat you up at that time. You're probably the weakest that you could possibly be. You're dehydrated, your mouth is dry, you're not even thinking about eating cakes, you just want a sip of water, and you're not particularly healthy out there. I mean, we've all seen bodybuilders pass out backstage. I've seen one fall off the stage. It's a pretty extreme sport, right?
it's a game of attrition, man. It's like who can starve themselves long enough that they get peeled and then get rewarded for it. It's fucking weird.
It is weird. It is an unusual sport, but it's become. I mean, luckily the sport has grown due to social media exposing it and it being seen now. So it's grown faster than it has previously, and obviously the being in the supplement side of things, still with Stu and myself, we've seen that the demographic which now find this lifestyle appealing has broadened. Before it was typically the gym rats that grew up watching Dorian Yates videos and then and Ronnie Coleman training videos and stuff, and then sort of now it's expanded to Gen Pop is really coming into this space a lot and picking up some of the habits that, like you said, if you don't have the background of tracking for a few years, knowing your body, learning sensible nutrition and training, it can be like one of the main things that I think I found quite damaging was I never was much of a fan of, I'd say, the cheat meal space, for example. Now, during prep, I decided to go a coach because I thought I would just mind fuck myself if I did my own. I tend to change it too often, and I admire you for doing your own prep, bro. But I thought, I'll use a coach so I can remove the mental, the head noise from it. And they went for a cheat / refeed, and I found that really, I guess, potentially damaging if you weren't aware of what you were doing. I felt myself slipping into where you'd restrict for 6 days a week, and then on the 7th there was this binge, and it was encouraged. And it was really unusual. I'm like, wow, if this was someone's first introduction, this would put you in an eating disorder. Like, you're in extreme starvation to the point of where you're walking around faint and lightheaded throughout the day. But then on Sunday, you're allowed to go and pound burgers and pizza, and it's encouraged. And yeah, it's an absolutely bizarre space. So in that sort of area, I'd love to hear, like, are these some of the things you're trying to dispel in terms of, are these some of the things you see are common with clients that have come to you for preps in the past of this sort of behavior?
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of lucky now, I suppose, in that I have had my foot in the door as a prep coach for quite some time. So I kind of get a biased, self-selected client that has been watching me for a while, and they like my approach. So that can actually make my coaching easier, but it can also make me a worse coach because I don't learn to adapt and improve, because the people that come to me are the people that I want. But absolutely, dude, like I said to you before, this isn't a healthy space, but it doesn't mean it has to be the unhealthiest approach that you can possibly take. There can always be a safer alternative to an otherwise not so safe practice. So like my setup is exactly that, is that language is also very important. Like you said, if your experience to the cheat meal versus refeed, what are we setting that person up for psychologically to expect out of this? Are we telling them that you just get freedom now, like it's a diet break, or that it's here's your reward, Fido, well done, you were a good boy this week, go and eat yourself silly? Like, do we use that language, or do we say, hey, I understand you're probably a little bit worn out this week, we're going to refuel the system? We want to try and reset some of the stress, we want to try and wash off some of the fatigue. As a fellow that I follow, Victor Black, he uses that terminology, which I really like. And that for the individual then has an immediate association with the food has an intended target, and it's not to eat yourself silly, and it's not a cheat because you aren't a fucking dog. I should have probably checked if you guys swear on here because I've done it a few times, but
we did.
I apologize.
No, we did. No, we don't really have hard and fast rules, and we have lost Stu, but he would agree with you that it is 100% okay. But with I agree, it's very Pavlov, isn't it? Like when we're looking at these, the way that we starve the athlete Monday to Friday, and then on the weekend let your hair down, go nuts. It is this binge restrict, it's this reward cycle. But I think I found a lot of interest, and I'd love to pick your brain on your approach to the refeed space. I've seen some content around diet breaks come up on the page as well. So I'd like to sort of get because I think our listeners would get a lot of value out of trying to understand where and how this works. Apart from, say, like Lyle McDonald and a little bit of Norton and a bit of, say, BPAC, I think there hasn't been a huge amount done around how to actually use these things, or how to implement them, because people just do the whole, I'll just starve myself and then they have a cheat meal, which is an entirely useless strategy metabolically from my education. I don't see how one meal can have a positive effect apart from some very acute ghrelin manipulation. But where do you see the value of, say, of an actual structured refeed? And is that a multi-day event? Is that a singular thing? What's your take on how to best implement them?
So I suppose for people that aren't aware of what a refeed is, just for terminology perspective, we're talking about a single day or multiple days done back to back, or potentially intermittently, depending on the approach you want to take, whereby you re-escalate calories back to a perceived maintenance calorie. So the same calories as what you're burning is the same calories you're going to consume, perhaps slightly above it, in order to theoretically either reset fuel or refuel the system. Or there has been claims in the past that it would be trying to essentially re-engage, like you said, metabolic markers or metabolic hormones that are advantageous for continued fat loss, right? So there's this momentary break where you go, if you think of fat loss as pushing the accelerator, then there's this momentary point where you hit the brakes, you refuel the system, and you hope that it does what you want it to do physiologically. Now, there's the sort of anecdotal, empirical side of things whereby we've had people do these cheat meals and refeeds and diet breaks and all that in this space for years. And then there's also the research side. The research side has some really cool information coming out of obese populations whereby they might diet them heavily and hard for 1 to 3 weeks and then not diet them for a week. So they literally are breaking for an entire week. And at the end of those studies, we pretty much see all positive outcomes for those that take the diet breaks. And our diet break would be at least 5 to 7 days back at caloric maintenance. So that there's a lot of positive outcomes, some hormonal, some lean mass retention. Typically diet adherence is better, diet fatigue is less. The people come out the other end feeling better too, right? So it's like tick, 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 tick. And fat mass loss is almost always the same, if not better.
But is that just a manipulation of language? When you say training, when you're saying a week of a diet break, that's technically just a refeed, isn't it?
Well, it's an extended refeed. So the theory would be like a refeed is a 1 or 2 or maybe 3 day period within a week whereby you're refueling the system or refeeding the human. A diet break would be like, hey, we're actually trying to pause the fat loss component for an extended period of time in the hope that we see physiological benefits ongoing, because like you said, one meal, sweet fuck all in regards to impacting any physiological function. So any of that typical metabolic adaptation that we would see during dieting, all of the negatives associated with dieting aren't going to be improved with a single meal. And like years ago, man, Lyle brought this up and he went, I'm really positive for it. And they went, oh, that was a mistake. I think you need at least 2 to 3 days, at least.
Yep.
And then, you've got Bill Campbell, who does like a lot of metabolic research, and he shows some benefits with 2 to 3 day ones. We think, oh, this is getting more interesting now. We've got some research to potentially back up the bro approach, right? Which is what always happens because research only comes out of questions that are being created in the real world space. So typically they're either ahead of the game, we're trying to dispel the falsity of it, or we're trying to say, oh, why does this maybe happen? The most recent research that's come out is out of a guy out of Perth, Jackson Pios, awesome dude. I'd highly recommend you get him on if you want to dive deep on diet breaks, right? And he actually did an athlete study where they did 2 weeks of dieting with 1 week of a diet break. And then the other group just did deficit dieting for the entire 12 weeks. So one of the disadvantages of this diet break approach is that you basically extend the length of your dieting period, but theoretically it should be easier because you're pumping the brakes more frequently. Now, he hasn't released the research, so we can't really talk in absolutes, but the indication from him, at least in his sort of like look over the shoulder language, like, oh, this is what I'm saying, is that essentially the only true positives I believe he saw in that research from those that had the diet break was that diet fatigue was less, enjoyability was higher, performance maybe slightly higher, and they just didn't seem as irritable and annoyed all the time. The fat loss was about the same, and the lean muscle retention was about the same. So we'd have to say here now, like really, diet breaks are probably more about the psychology of dieting than they are about the actual physiology of dieting.
Yeah, phenomenal.
100%. That's something that I found as well when whenever I would be prepping was the refeed or the cheat meal or whatever you want to call it. Obviously my coaches at the time when I was competing weren't up to scratch on these diet breaks and that sort of thing. But for me, the refeed was what kept me going through the knowing that was to come. Mentally, that's what kept me going through some of those really, really tough, grueling periods where, I was dieting down, I was hungry all the time, and, I was busting cardio. And I'd think to myself on Sunday, I've got this meal coming, and that would keep driving me forward. So there's definitely something to be said for that, like you said, that mental aspect of it, or that, even if it's to do with some positive brain chemistry or keeping cortisol down or whatever it might be, I think there's still something to be said for that, right? If you feel like something is beneficial for you, then at some level it probably is.
Absolutely. There's no doubt in the world that the greatest drug that we could ever have is placebo, right? But there is a caveat to all of this research comment that I think is worth talking about, is that most people, when they look at the research, they look at the results and they look at it and go, it says that there's no benefit. It's statistically considered to be the same. But what they don't go and look at is like, okay, there was 50 individuals that did this. And then what was the spread of results? Because some people would have got no results, some people would have got fucking awesome results, some people would have got neutral results. But the average may have been neutral. But it doesn't mean that it's not beneficial for everybody. You know, you see this in drug research all the time too. So there are certainly individuals that I'm aware of that I've at least experienced or thought it to be the case, which maybe it wasn't. Maybe they just didn't eat what they were supposed to eat. But there are certainly indications that individuals have varying metabolic adaptation speeds. And at opposite ends of the spectrum too. You know, some people can eat an abundance of food that doesn't make sense and they don't get fat. And then other people have to diet so significantly lower than what we would expect them to. For whatever reason, their adaptation to the negative is just really, really unfortunate. So those individuals are the ones that I typically find require the breaking more frequently. And then there's other individuals that are just super resilient. You can just diet them the whole way. You know, It really depends. But I would say that my personal experience is that every client that I've ever refed on a regular basis has almost always got better results.
Do you find that those variations in I guess metabolic ability, do you find that those variations, people who are uneducated in the space tend to use that and say, there you go, there's proof that that calories in, calories out is bogus, or there's proof that a caloric deficit means nothing, or, you know, do you find that people can't really understand the fact that, you know, that just because we have adapted metabolically differently, it doesn't disprove calories in, calories out?
No, it actually continues to prove it. It's just that people have a misunderstanding of what that language is saying. Like if you like, let's just put some arbitrary numbers on and say, like, you know, Will, you adapt at 50% and now your 1800 calories is maintenance. And Stu, you adapt at 30% and your maintenance is now 2400. It doesn't matter how much you adapt. If you're consuming the same amount of calories that you've adapted to, it's still maintenance. Like the word maintenance means exactly that. It's maintenance. Like words have meanings.
I found, I think it was actually Bill Campbell that put some research up recently. It might have been him. I found when you mentioned your adaptation and the body's a beautifully efficient thing at that. I found that an interesting thing, particularly around the prep space, was just the sheer downshift you can have metabolically is incredible. And this is a really nice segue into, I guess, the post dieting sort of questioning. But you know, like for example, some natural athletes found they had up to a 47% decrease in BMR towards the end of towards the end of their prep. Now, you know, when you say you have less room to forgive in female athletes, now imagine that on a female whose beginning maintenance might be 1800 to 1, let's say, as an active athlete, and then you halve that, and then you try and create a deficit on that, and then you wonder why the thyroid starts to shut down and they have amenorrhea very early on, and et cetera, et cetera. So in your world, then the exiting space, this fascinates me. There's a lot of talk around reverse dieting has been popular. Where do you see the, I guess, best practice exiting from a comp? You know, getting away from the dieting space. Do you ramp up gradually? Do you go straight back to maintenance? What do you think athletes should be looking to do as sort of best practice?
The line would be is that you should return calories physiologically back as fast as you possibly can handle psychologically. That's really that's the sort of combination issue.
I thought you were going to say the secret is the Ronnie Coleman belly cream.
Yes, far out, easy too. Yeah, that's my thing. Like, I want to return baseline calories back as quick as humanly possible, so long as you can psychologically handle it. Because, you know, if there's going to be some disconnect between what you can psychologically handle in fear of fat gain and all the rest of it, that I'm saying this is the best way to do it. It's not the best way for that individual. But I would say, like, physiologically, the best way to do it is to get calories back to perceived maintenance and above it as quick as possible, e.g. tomorrow, because that's the only way you're going to reset metabolic downregulation. Only way. But that person has to be psychologically ready to gain weight. And they need to understand that the initial weight gain is going to be primarily glycogen, you know, and then eventually it's going to obviously be some fat. But we definitely need to control the refeeding process, because you're at a higher risk for essentially creating additional fat cells. Like, that's the one time that they've shown in like post-starvation studies that you can get hyperplasia of fat cells in extreme overfeeding, post-extreme dieting. So that's a risky fucking period.
It is. And that's an area that I think you start to see some weird and wonderful things happen, not just with, as Stu mentioned before, female athletes running into issues, but just across the board. I think the original bro myth was, you know, after a comp, your body's in this starvation mode. You can pump it as many calories as you want. You'll just get jacked and put on 10 kilos in 2 weeks. that's going to be a very unfavorable 10 kilos. It was going to be a really, really rough bit of weight. I found the body composition is typically quite depressing when you're in such a metabolically stunted position. So when you say as much as they can psychologically handle with the goal of maintenance, so do you typically find across the board that's an extended period? Because I see there's a tendency of a lot of coaches to tend to really go a slow and steady, 6, 8, 12 weeks. Some people would say doing a reverse diet as long as the diet. And I agree to an extent in walking calories up. If you finish peak week in like 2,000 calories and you're normally at 4K, well, I'm not going to, fair enough. But, where do you see, is that purely the only reason you do it, just to see what they can mentally handle? Or do you see any validity in slowly walking calories up towards maintenance, or?
Physiologically, no. I would see no advantage to doing that. You're just slowing down the process of returning to normal. And you got to think every time you do that, you're essentially just in a state of varied starvation, whereby you're then going to have more hunger. You're going to have more sort of a reward-seeking behavior. You're going to have more fatigue. Your libido is not going to return. There's potentially people that then have even issues with hair loss, all that sort of shit, right? So the longer you delay that return to baseline, the worse you'll be.
I can tell you, Dean, I used to walk off stage and go straight to a 4,000 calorie meal. So I had no problem psychologically returning to plenty of food.
Well, this is most guys are okay in a gaining phase. It's culturally accepted for a male to be a larger human in the off season because I'm growing, It's not as culturally acceptable, unfortunately, for females to do similar, even though it should be, So most of the girls, unfortunately, that are stuck between a rock and a hard place where they understand they need to do this physiologically, but psychologically they really struggle with shifting out of that body fat range. And the thing that sucks the most, man, is it's even unhealthier for them than it is for the dudes. We're talking about people that need to procreate for life, and they can potentially messing with that,
This is the other end of the spectrum that I really want to dig into, because I think there's been so much oh God, the bulking culture. Hey, as someone who's done both ends of the spectrum, gone up and down 20, 30 kilos throughout the year, and, then taken 12 months to diet it off sensibly. I think the yo-yoing is more damaging than anything. What's your approach to this? Because I think this would be so valuable to listeners, because I don't think there's a lot of obviously fat loss is a massive thing. If you go on the internet, there's a billion articles around all things to do with lipolysis. But if you look at anything to do with the gaining phase, it's essentially just put in a deficit, go for gold, put in a surplus, go for gold. How big is it? What's that look like for you when you're planning your athletes off season, say? It's obviously not going. It's going to be controlled and structured. So what kind of surplus are we talking? Are we thinking a small, a big surplus? How do you structure a classic sort of off season approach?
I use a lot of reference range numbers for a lot of my crew. Even in the return to baseline you just mentioned before, I don't know if I had pretty clarity on that, so I'll just clear that up quickly too. Is that before someone starts a dieting prep phase, they'll have a certain caloric limitation that I'm recognizing you can handle about this amount of calories per kilogram, and that maintains your weight. And then when they get down through the dieting phase, I re-reference that to their current weight and go, oh, this is probably what they could tolerate, provided metabolically they were okay. Now we might say, we'll allow for a small reduction in metabolic activity, 10 to 15%. So I'll put their calories straight back to that, expected maintenance minus 10 to 15%, but giving them the freedom to also have some things that aren't tracked and aren't counted because they're going to do it anyway. So I may as well allow for it, right? And then that's my first starter process. So it's almost back to maintenance. But in the gaining phase, it's very similar. We set somebody up with what would be a perceived maintenance calories, and we assess biofeedback. Does their weight stabilize after a certain period of time? Are they getting an additional adiposity? How's their performance? If we're taking it right down the level, do they have regulated blood sugar, basal blood sugar in the mornings, that kind of stuff? And then once we're aware of what we think their perceived maintenance is, then I'm going to bump them somewhere in the sort of 10% vicinity to start with. And then we're just going to constantly just look at biofeedback every week. Photos, blood glucose, blood pressure, resting heart rate, performance markers, you name it. And then if we can, circumferences of skin folds, something like that would be obviously advantageous too. And then we're just going to slowly work calories up to support the demands that we're imposing on them to get the adaptation that we wish to achieve.
Keep going. Sorry, mate.
Yeah. And there'll just be a point where basically we're looking for is adiposity coming on at a rate that's too fast to account for also lean muscle gain? Because we know that lean muscle gain doesn't come on at any greater speed unless you essentially just drug it on. So, and if assuming that we're not going to just try and drug on muscle all the time, as opposed to using it as a supporting mechanism, then that's when we're starting to look at that feedback. And it might be like a slow, steady escalation of calories over time, knowing that a slow, steady escalation of calories over time can't result in extreme adiposity because there's not an available amount of calories to do that. And then once we've worked their body fat up to a level that's both uncomfortable for them and also not too far from stage weight, stabilize, try a re-escalation. And if we can't get it out of them, then it's back down into like a bit of a mini cut, a cleanup phase, and then start the process again.
Okay. Where do you stand on using things like exogenously in this process? You know, I'm talking about things like thyroxine, T4, you know, even metformin to an extent with the blood sugar regulation. Where do you stand on using those kind of tools? Do you use them in the process, or do you prefer to do it entirely with dietary and lifestyle changes?
Well, of course, I'm not a doctor, so I'd only be giving general entertainment advice. But I'm not comfortable with thyroid use in a surplus. Your thyroid should be fucking ramping. Like, there's no reason why it should have a problem in a surplus. I think there's potentially some efficacy in using it in a dieting phase to maintain metabolic output, not to enhance metabolic output. Very different approach. I think metformin is kind of one of those pharmacologies, that doesn't really seem to have too many or if any negatives for people to be concerned about, but likely has a lot of positives. But again, like, so long as it's not bastardized, like we might be talking about like 500 milligrams being used once a day in an ongoing fashion, just to provide another little pathway of stimulation that you otherwise can't achieve without it.
Yeah. I see a lot of very educated people being very okay with metformin being used ongoing, because like you said, there's really, I think a lot of the chronic lifestyle diseases of the 21st century seem to be very much linked to insulin resistance in a big way. And I think if you can at least limit that hepatic pathway, like, sort of at least put a handbrake on one part of it. I mean, there's enough between GLUT4 and like, there's enough other things, safety mechanisms in the body for it not to be a drama. I'm of the same opinion. I really can't see any negatives and only positives. It seems to be one of those really quite, I guess, health promoting.
That's exactly that. You're reducing hepatic glucose release. So lower blood sugar over the course of the day is typically going to result in better blood glucose panels. If you look at a bodybuilder who's trying to escalate body weight, they're doing that with an abundance of food, an abundance of calories, potentially an increase in adiposity and an increase in weight. All of those things potentially increase risk of insulin resistance. If you're using growth hormone, that doubles down a little bit, because now we have additional blood sugars floating around the system for an extended period of time. So like, maybe it helps offset some of that. And then like, there are some caveats. Like, so there's some rodent research that is suggesting that maybe if you have a predisposition to things like Alzheimer's and all the rest of it, that may be some slight indications to just be concerned with the impact of it on the increased degeneration of some of those factors that happen in the brain that I'm not aware of because it's not my field. But I mean, I think it's like a small, like, just be aware of this, but don't really be concerned by it. And then you'd lump in that lactic acidosis in the same field too. Like, it's such a small portion. The worst thing that most people experience with metformin is acute gastrointestinal distress.
Yep.
But the cool thing about it is it actually seems to increase and improve and balance out microbiota. So like, we're talking about a microbial improvement from metformin as well in the stomach.
Yep.
So like, metformin has an abundance of goodies for a very, very low risk profile.
Yeah. Also, has been shown to be, regardless of whether or not you are kind of into the NAD plus boosters or anything like that, metformin is one of the most powerful NAD boosters that we have available to us as well. So if you're into the anti-aging and longevity space, metformin's pretty much as good as you can get right now for increasing NAD and sirtuin production. So they've been able to dramatically increase the lifespan in rodents anyway by using regular metformin. So very interesting stuff. Dean, I just wanted to switch, switch paths a little bit. It's something that you're obviously a science enthusiast or an advocate of all things science, and as am I. But in saying that, I'm still somewhat superstitious with certain things. Like, for example, when I'm doing comp prep, I'll do some things that I know are not backed by the science, but I will, like, say, for example, I know that there's no potential harm from them. I'll do them anyway, just as a superstition. Like, for example, your transdermal, creams and this sort of thing. I'll do those during a comp prep. Just, hey, for superstition's sake, I'll throw it in. Is there anything like that? Probably not so much that you would have your clients do, but that you, I guess, maybe even did yourself during prep. I've seen guys doing things like eating tons of asparagus or just strange things that we don't necessarily have the science to back. But do you have any superstitions that you throw in regardless of science, I guess?
I would never do it regardless of science, in that I wouldn't go against. If the body of evidence suggests that my decision is a poor decision, then I wouldn't do that. But I think, like in your instance, like you're saying, there's no real harm to it. I don't mind. Like, like part of my onboarding process is even like, okay, what supplements do you take? Like, oh, I take a BCAA. Why do you do that? I like the flavor of intra-workout. Okay, cool. Is that within your budget to continue to do that? Yes. Cool. Thumbs up. It's same with massage. It's like I get massage because I feel good. I'm like, all right, like, do I now tear this person down and say mechanistically it doesn't seem like massage actually does what people suggest it does? Like, no, that's a bad coach. Like, I'm creating a negative out of a positive. But whether or not I've done anything, I wouldn't say like superstitious like that. I mean, I've definitely, in my last prep, I thought, like, if I can, I will. And like an instance of that would be, does fasted cardio in the morning really make a difference? Probably not. But if I can, and I can stack the habits and that in my advantage there, e.g., like, can I wake up, use metformin, use some clenbuterol, take my thyroid, give myself a little bit of a break, plus some growth hormone, and then go walk? Would that potentially liberate a little bit more fatty acids and drive that pathway that I'm trying to drive? Maybe. So if I can, will I? Why not? But it doesn't mean that I would say this is the only way or you have to do this, but rather, if it's a possibility, we may as well attempt it.
What about things like chugging vodka backstage, or, I've seen all sorts of different carb sources used for pumping up. I've seen guys popping Viagras and Cialis back there.
I have done that.
Yeah. Would you say that's of potential benefit? I mean, obviously it's a powerful vasodilator.
I might use Cialis. I don't know if it did anything, to be perfectly honest. Like, it's, what is it, a PDE5 inhibitor? Yeah. It's not really driving actual blood flow specifically, but there are a lot of people that do those sorts of things. I think every coach has a carbohydrate preference for backstage, mainly just because it kind of helps them. But I mean, peak week's a really interesting one, man, because there's so much psychological buy-in on there needing to be a change in order to maximize the look. And often is the case is that, like, all of the data that we've accumulated over the course of a prep tells me this person really doesn't need much of a peak week. But they're coming to you saying, what are we doing, coach? Like, and then you have to ask yourself, like, do I tell them nothing and then they do something anyway? Or do I just do a little bit and really amp up the expectation so that they're psychologically prepared for it? Yeah. So I will sometimes do things within a peak week, and I'll use language that would imply that we're doing things to achieve a particular outcome, when in actual fact, it's not really doing what I'm saying it is. Well, it may do, but it's probably not that big of a deal, just so that athlete is, like, bought in on the process.
Yep. See, it's interesting you say that. Like, I know Aaron Pilates, he kind of believes that you should be ready to step on stage like 2 weeks out, 3 weeks out. You should be ready to walk onto stage 3 weeks out. It doesn't matter if they push the show forward. He's fine. He could walk onto stage if it was 2 days earlier than it was. Not a worry. Is that sort of your process as well, or have you ever got to a point where you're 3 weeks out and you're panicking with the client and you're going, oh man,
as in they won't be ready?
You wouldn't leave yourself. Yes.
I mean, for sure I have. We've all had clients that haven't made the condition that's to the expectation of myself, but I'm of the same opinion. I typically will have people, like, set up to be ready at around the 3 to 4 week out mark.
Yep.
So that I can at least start to test things if I want to.
If there's someone who can
add food back in.
If there's someone who is, if you get to that 3 weeks out and you, Dean, look at them and panic a little bit, is it recoverable at that point? Is 3 weeks enough time to make significant change and get someone stage ready?
You can certainly make significant change. The question will be whether or not you can reestablish, I suppose, like a lower net systematic stress level, whereby then a peak week works effectively. Or if that person can actually tolerate what you may have to put them through. And then you also have to consider drug status. Like if it's a natural athlete, probably not, because what you would have to do to achieve that level of condition in that short period of time, the back end of a prep when you're at your most stressed situation, that's not going to be conducive for them maintaining muscle tissue. But if you're a drug-induced athlete, man, you can pretty much belt the shit out of that person and they'll be all right. You know, like there's been some horrendous protocols I've seen. And if that person get on stage with muscle, anyone can, you know.
Isn't that phenomenal? I think that like what I always think is the most underestimated part of PED use, because it seems to have, it's another part of the whole, you know, it has its own, you know, sort of bro sciencey sort of romance behind it, where people just, you know, like glorify it, and it's a very glorified drug culture. But I think people one of the most appealing aspects of it in that particular environment is the ability to be. It's a massive parasympathetic driver. When you say you can just bash athletes when they're not, you know, the untested guys, those guys can really just cop a pounding and they can bounce back. Whereas a natural athlete won't have those reserves, you know, because you can only drive the sympathetic so hard and, you know, and still expect any sort of, you know, positive result from it. I think that's interesting too, that you take into account what can they. Yes, you can achieve the result, but at what cost physiologically too? Like how much of a hole are you going to bury this person to get them peeled? You know, like if they're willing to trade off the next 6 weeks or 8 weeks in damage control, maybe, but after the comp. But
I guess that poses an interesting question too, Will, that you've just mentioned. If we're looking, Dean, at a natural athlete versus an enhanced athlete, which athlete are we doing more damage to during this extreme kind of phase? Are we doing more damage,
good question,
I guess, long term to someone where we're using these enhanced substances, or are we doing more damage to the natural athlete? We're pushing them both to skin and bone. Who are we doing more? Like, you know, we've said it's a damaging process. This is really not a healthy thing to be doing for anyone, regardless of if you're natural or enhanced. But who are we causing more damage to?
If we were to assume that the drug protocols in place are under a safer use model and not stupidity, because there's a lot of stupidity in the drug using world, right? So if I was just to say, put an asterisk on it and say, hey, I think this is a safer use model, they're not doing anything silly, it would be arguable that it's far unhealthier for a male to not use drugs and do a contest prep, at least endocrinologically, than it would be to use drugs.
I knew I could rely on you to say something to that effect. I was hoping you would, because it's so under discussed. That exact data that was around the downregulation from the BMR also showed a significant decrease in total and free testosterone, massive increases in 24-hour cortisol, both urinary and salivary. It was horrendous. It was a train wreck. Like, and I argue this a lot of I agree. I think if you're a natural athlete, I mean, both are bad, but when you look at how much of a hit you take hormonally, in terms of metabolically, I tend to think you're sort of actually better hijacking your hormones. You know, if you're overriding one system, if you're going T3, you've got that part of the HPT axis covered, got a basal testosterone dosage, you've got at least that part of your endocrine system taken care of. You're sort of going, okay, my body would otherwise go down here. I'm going to hold it at idle here. But that comes in the whole sensible drug use part, I suppose, right?
Let's just say if the goal of a bodybuilder wasn't to be massive in an untested federation, and they did just hack their life and basically replace the things that get downregulated to a point where you actually become quote unquote unhealthier, then yeah, for sure, dude. Because like some of those guys in that research you were referencing to, like we're talking about like almost castrate level testosterone levels within very short periods, not even at the end. We're talking like straight away, just because of the severity of the dieting. And then some of them are like not even returning to baseline at 12 months.
Yeah, that was where, but I guess inversely, it's worth talking about because I think Stu and I have both been on the same page, and we're both very happy to talk about exogenous hormone because
we've got Bill Llewellyn coming on in a few episodes.
Oh, cool.
We keep saying that. We keep saying it, and he's every time I contact him, he's like, yeah, next week for sure. But no, we've got Bill Llewellyn coming on, so we'll obviously be discussing exogenous hormones.
It's just good to talk about it sensibly though, because it's such a I find it refreshing, you know, because it's such a. Because it has this stigma around it, has this all this myth and you know and bro science around it. No one ever talks about the actual, you know, how the stuff actually works in your body, how, you know, and what it will actually do. And I tend to think if handled, you know, sensibly in that environment, it probably would be the least impact. But the return to normal part in both scenarios is the tricky, is where the caveat, isn't it? Like in the natural athletes, you're right. I've seen up, like 6 month plus returns to baseline total test. And in PCT environment, similar time frame realistically before you see decent hormonal profiles recover.
Well, this sort of comes back to that research that I was talking about before, though. Unfortunately, fortunately, there's going to be genetically resistant individuals that tolerate the stress very well. Unfortunately, there's going to be very sensitive individuals that don't tolerate the stress very well. And then there's going to be a lot of people in the middle that it does absolutely nothing to, and they don't even know, And that's the problem with this, is that you don't really know how you're going to cope with the stress until you induce it and then deal with the consequences. So like if we were to say, take fertility research, men that have been put under like really harsh fertility regimes using exogenous testosterone, exogenous progesterone. I read one the other day, even I recapped on it using trestenolone, which is crazy hard. They did it, like 12 weeks of drugs like this that will shut down fertility to a 90% success rate. That's why it's not used as fertility in men, because it doesn't work sufficiently, more than condoms and all the rest of it. But like those individuals all return to baseline fertility health, and they all return to baseline testosterone health for the most part. It's just that some take 1 to 2 months, some take 12 months. And that's the shit thing. I mean, the cool thing is that almost all return to baseline. It's just that you don't know which part of it you're going to suck at, or if you're going to be really good at it. That's the scary part with all this hormone sort of introduction.
This is a good segue, because we're looking at actual data now. We're looking at biomarkers for health, and I think that's something that gets in an industry that isn't healthy. That's very much you're either force feeding you're bulking to the point you're force feeding, or you're restricting to the point that you're essentially starving yourself. I think what I would love to pick your brain on what are some of the common biomarkers you see going to the toilet when you're dealing with people who have been in the game a long time, like a lot of our listeners being store owners, people who compete regularly, athletes themselves, people who love might be using a lot of supplements or what have you, just people generally interested in this lifestyle. Because I've seen a lot of people with like high blood pressure. You mentioned that's really commonly elevated. Like that was what actually sort of prompted me to get you on, was your discussion with Luke Lehman on your podcast actually about that, where he found he had in London, I think it was, he had a seminar, and it was something like only 2 PTs in the entire room had quote unquote normal blood pressure. And we had a room of personal trainers, people who were meant to be teaching other people how to be healthy, and everyone was in stage 1 hypertension. And I experienced this myself as well during varying periods of stress. So what are some of the things you see that are unhealthy in our space, or common things you see a bit skewed from a normal quote unquote health, and remedies, I suppose, like, to help our listeners if they're, like what's some things actionables we can give them to sort of, move away from these common trends?
First of all, people don't test for this stuff. That's one of the biggest problems, especially PED using individuals. Like one of the things that commonly kills PED users, like people say, like, show me the bodies from steroid use. It's like, that's never going to go on their death certificate. Like, they didn't die from steroids. They died from associated health markers that got skewed. And that's going to be heart and kidneys, almost always for everyone. And then the one thing that's going to cause the most amount of pressure on both of those things is blood pressure. So like if you're a PED using male or even female, and you have escalated body weight above the norm, so that people will bastardize BMI, right? It's a shit measurement. Doesn't account for muscle weight. That's fine. It's looking at what's the total pressure imparted on your body based on your square sort of centimeters. And then does that potentially induce additional stress above what we want it to, that you then have to be aware of? And the answer to that is yes, regardless of if it's muscle or if it's fat. If your BMI is skewed, that's additional stress that you otherwise probably wouldn't tolerate if you were quote unquote in a healthy weight range. So if you're a PD using individual and you're above that BMI, that's something that you should definitely be regularly checking all the time, which would be blood pressure, because it's one of the first ones that will skew, and it's one of the first ones that will put a bunch of stress on your system. So just measuring it is the first point. And then as to like whether or not, what can you do to sort of intervene, you'd have to try and determine where that blood pressure rise is coming from. Like, do they have really poor aerobic health? And if they do, then that podcast with Luke Lehman is a perfect sort of segue to say, hey, listen to something like that. Because a person who's aerobically healthier theoretically will have like a larger stroke volume, which means they'll have a greater relaxation of the heart and a greater capacity to pump more blood per pump, which means they need less pumps, lower resting heart rate, less pressure coming back into the heart, lower risk for all-cause mortality. And you improve that with aerobic health. So you need to do some cardio.
Okay. That's an interesting one, because cardio is just thrown on the back burner a lot. I myself fell under the same dogma for a long time where it was always, cardio is only a calorie burning tool. You only do it during prep. In your off season, you're struggling to eat enough calories to grow anyway. Why would you want to burn more? So speaking to that school, when you're saying cardiovascular, are you saying specifically, you're probably like things that are designed to increase fitness per se, as opposed to a calorie burner? And what does it look like for a lot of your guys, or yourself even? Like, what's cardio look like to you in a weekly basis? How does it fit in?
So right now I don't do any formalized cardio because all of my biomarkers are within a healthy checked range. As my weight escalates, my expectation, at least it looks like the trend is going right now as I escalate weight, then my resting heart rate's starting to come up a little bit, and my blood pressure's just moved a couple of points in the last few weeks. Now, if that stabilizes with escalated weight, I might hold it for a while, but if not, then yeah, you're going to start with a baseline level of aerobic fitness. Now, something like that might look like 20 to 30 minutes, 2 to 3 times a week in a heart rate range of somewhere around the 110 to 130 mark, So it's just repeat, consistent, low-level cardio. Once you get through that phase, though, then you've got to say, like, can I get more bang for my buck? And you can if you just do some form of like interval-esque based training. One of the ones that Luke referenced in there is one that I use quite regularly, and that is that I'll still have them do 20 minutes of work, but it might be like 1 minute of hard work and then 4 minutes of baseline cardio. And the goal is to basically escalate your heart rate up to a higher level. It might be like the 140s to 160s for about a minute or two, and then let it come back down through steady state cardio into the 110 to 130s. And your average over the course of that 20 minutes will still be about 110 to 130. So you're still sitting in that typical aerobic fitness without it being too anaerobic. But you're doing some anaerobic work, which is also going to give you some additional adaptation. And then you might do that 2 to 3 times a week for 20 minutes as well. The one thing that you can appreciate with cardio, like for now to sell this, to choose the appropriate language for those that say, I don't want to do cardio because it's going to limit my ability to eat more food and all the rest of it, is that the fitter you are cardiovascularly and cardiorespiritually, the more work you can do in the gym, the faster you recover between sets, therefore the more tonnage you can achieve as well. So your capacity to train goes up. Also, you can kind of live life a little bit less in pain, a little bit less out of breath. It's kind of nice. You don't always have to be on the bottom as a dude.
We've all been tragically unfit, haven't we?
I want to ask you about, Dean, while we've still got a little bit of your time, is I want to talk about, nutritional supplements. I want to talk about exogenous vitamins, minerals, nutrients, even your macronutrients. I guess you touched on a little bit earlier in the conversation about, not being a huge fan of branched chain amino acids. What are some of the supplements that you do incorporate, maybe either in your lifestyle or in your athlete programs?
Let's asterisk this and say that the majority of people that I work with are IFBB competitors. So they are untested federation individuals.
Yeah.
So most of my setup is always centered around like, what can't we get nutritionally? And what do we need to maximize this person's health or decrease the potential risks of some of the additional curricular stuff that they're doing? Most of that's going to be centered around driving up antioxidant capacity and decreasing oxidative stress, because PEDs do that in of themselves. So does being a larger human. And then also regulating blood glucose if we can. So, and then anything you can't get from the diet. So like I have a couple that are pretty typical for most PED using individuals. That would be something as simple as like acrylo or a fish oil. Most people aren't getting that from the diet. Vitamin D3, zinc, because you need more of that mineral as a PED using male and as a larger male. Magnesium, because you need more of that as a training individual as well. And then there'd be some side shoot stuff like vitamin K2, the M7 version, great for cardiovascular health, decreasing potentially plaque buildup and all that kind of stuff. And then maybe like just a baseline chromium. Yep. And then you can then go really down the rabbit hole on driving up antioxidant capacity. Like you can do vitamin C's, vitamin E's, all of those things. CoQ10.
You do resveratrol and
you can do resveratrol. Yeah. It's not something that's like on my list of just basics, but it's something that I would consider adding in.
Yep.
Even something, like a high dose EGCG green tea extract is still going to be great from an antioxidant capacity. All of those additions will really depend on the person's capacity to eat food. So like I'm exceptionally good at eating a lot of fruits and vegetables.
Yep.
Like even on my high phase right now, I'm still eating 850 veggies a day and 650 fruit.
Yeah.
Wow.
Do you have your athletes do shakes? Do you put protein into their diet with shakes?
If they can't consume it, yeah. Typically not a shake though. I'm like, who wants to drink protein these days? Use it like in rice pudding or something like that,
Yeah, make a,
but no,
make
of course,
a mousse or something.
Yeah. I have a guy at the moment who just straight up hates vegetables, hates them, and doesn't even really eat fruit. And I'm like, Jesus, man, like, what do we do? So like him, for example, in the morning, he does a blended fruit shake with fruit juice and added spinach, because you can't taste spinach in that. So he does that, and it's delicious. He loves it. And then he does a large vegetable bake with garlic and onion and zucchini and mushrooms and all these sorts of things. And then he blends that with passata, and he uses that as sauce. Yep. So like that's another way for me to get vegetables into that individual who otherwise wouldn't typically eat them.
I think you were saying this was the case as well with manipulating food volume. People like Will Crozier as well, who was a quite accomplished powerlifter who actually went to his meet looking more like a bodybuilder than anything. He was
Yeah.
peeled, man, like an absolute mutant. But unlike us, he could actually perform at that body fat percentage. And he was someone that I remember you saying he was driving like 5K plus cows or something crazy. And in
the off season, I've had him up to 1,250 carbs a day. Like he's been up there. Yeah.
Shivers. When are you, with macronutrients, out of curiosity, when you're manipulating those, one thing I just wanted to, just for personal curiosity, what do you see? There seems to be a habit, particularly with the PED guys, they pretty much only look at protein and carbs, because I guess when you're removing the whole, cholesterol, pregnenolone, DHEA, like main normal pathway for hormone production being sourced on fats, when you don't need to produce your own anymore, do you involve a great deal of sort of dietary fats and EFAs in your diet, in their diet, just for other, cellular integrity, I guess? Or what's that look like for you split wise? Because I tend to see a lot of people put a lot less importance when as soon as they throw exogenous hormones in, they just go, oh, well, all I need to worry about is protein and carbs. And that's how they get that, 1,000 grams of carb a day intake and crazy stuff. But I see a lot of natty guys who have to actually care about their, exogenous about their endogenous production, and, they're 20, 30, 40% fats. So do you like change that split depending on whether it's enhanced or not?
Not massively. So like the minimum effective fats will typically go for will be like 0.5 gram per kilogram of body weight. You'll cover all of your, and then out of that, like we're going to assume that some of it is hopefully coming from a fish source, and then the rest of it is coming from either just trace fats in meats, or we're going to add in things like nuts, seeds, dark chocolate, fish oil, whatever it may be, right? So like other quote unquote healthy fats. Most of the hormone production, at least my understanding, comes from endogenous created cholesterol through that pathway. It's not actually coming from exogenous consumption. So like you could argue that once you pass essential fatty acid consumption, that happens at like a very, 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 very low consumption of fatty acids from your diet. So at 0.5, we're saying like you're already well within range, so long as those fats aren't just coming from garbage. And then you can continue to escalate those up. The reason why I think a lot of larger individuals shift towards carbohydrates then is because theoretically there's no additional benefit outside of palatability to enhance fats above passing the essential fatty acid content. So like, and then as carbohydrates and calories rise, you have a higher propensity to store body fat from additional fat than what you will from additional carbohydrates or protein. Yep. So like, why not, let's not miss out on the potential performance aspects of more carbohydrates by saying, hey, we want more fats. So that might be, say, for example, people on a high calorie diet for me might be like 0.7 grams per kilogram. I'll almost never take someone above 1 gram per kilogram though.
Yep. When we talk about those fats, you have a preference there, as do I, for my athletes to get those, those omega 3, 6s, 9s from fish. Do you often run into the issue where you have an athlete that doesn't eat seafood? Because I've prepped a few people in my time and they just won't eat seafood, and I really try to lean them towards eating it. And even for me, myself, I don't love seafood, but when I'm prepping, if my coach said, eat a dead pigeon, if that's going to make me perform better, I'll do it. Is that something that you run into issues with, or are you happy to just supplement it with things like krill oil and fish oil?
It's always preferential to get it from food.
Yep.
But yes, like some people aren't going to eat it. And then I'm going to say, okay, next best option is X. I'm that guy, man. I don't really love seafood. I particularly don't really like salmon. Really it's going to be the go-to fatty acid based fish that most people are going to consume. Like I'd rather have eggs. So I'll have eggs, get some, and then I'll just supplement the rest of it in, It's a tough one, hey. In saying that, just a little side shoot though, one, you mentioned this, and this is not even related. I think people don't understand the importance of enjoying food when it comes to digestibility. You know, like we have a cephalic response when you look at food and when you smell food, that if you enjoy the look of it and the smell of it, your digestive process starts and it works way better. If you're sitting there gagging on food and then you're constantly bloated, just fucking eat something you like.
So don't do the old hold the nose, put it in your mouth and just eat it like a duck.
Yeah. Yeah. None of that poor goose. That poor goose fucking force-fed food, whatever that was. That what is it? I won't attempt to say the French word. Yeah.
Is one, and I guess we're conscious of your time's value, mate. But I think one little rabbit hole I'd love to shoot down just quickly would be carbohydrate. It gets bashed, it goes up and down, particularly now keto's become super trendy for whatever reason. There's also been a lot of people pushing towards the carnivore space, so obviously very protein heavy. And you see people quoting studies from anywhere up to like 4, 5, 6 grams per kilo of protein, and really pushing that end. You see people pushing fats up to like 75, 80% of your macros, that end. But no one really, carbs haven't been looked at much. They've been bashed a lot. And when you mentioned there, just, you're saying, look, half a gram to 0.7 gram per kilo is enough to sort of satisfy most requirements for fats. So are you sort of saying then that the rest, do you often find that you recommend a higher carb diet for most people, I guess, quote unquote high? And what does that look like in a normal, and is that more of a test? Is that a natural athlete? Does that change a great deal? Like in general, do you say like higher carb is the most sensible approach?
I would say at the moment, every one of my crew are on a higher partition carbohydrate diet than they are any other macronutrient. From a focus perspective, there might be some variability in percentage of calories, but that might just be dependent on the calorie consumption they're doing. But almost always it's preferentially being pushed towards glucose. There are some individuals that will preferentially like a little bit more fat and they'll get it. But otherwise it's mainly going towards carbohydrates.
Is that purely because, like, I tend to think, I look at that and personally would just think intuitively, I mean, does that not just drive towards, particularly as you go off-season model, does that not lean you down the rabbit hole, though, potentially leading towards an insulin-resistant model sooner, in that you pre and post workout, cool, like around the PIP bracket, no dramas. More than happy to drive infinite glucose. But I'm just curious, like in a lot of athletes, when you're really driving high calories, do you find that will, like, are carbohydrates indiscriminately throughout the day in a high calorie setting going to drive insulin resistance and not be potentially advantageous to gaining lean mass? Or
I consume a lot of carbs, Will, but I just look at the glycemic index. So for me, if I'm consuming a buttload of carbs, I make sure that I'm consuming carbs that are releasing glucose slowly into the bloodstream, so that I don't get that extreme insulin response that you would from the high GI carbs. I'll use those around my workout. Is that sort of similar to what you would do, Dean, or do you take a different approach?
I would think that if you were to look at glycemic index in isolation, probably not so much. It's more now, even if you like to take the cohort of individuals that have to be most aware of blood glucose regulation, diabetics, the standardized practice now is to more so look at glycemic load, not glycemic index. And the short of that could be that if you had a high GI food in a low consumption versus a low GI food in a high consumption, the glycemic load may be the same, and therefore they have to be equally as aware of how to manage their insulin dosing.
Because 60 grams of carbs is still 60 grams of carbs, right? Regardless of whether that's coming from bananas or straight dextrose, right?
No, not so much. So like you could say that if a high GI was considered quote unquote bad in the past, we're saying that's not necessarily the case, because it's more to do with the glycemic load. So like if you look at a carrot, for example, that's considered to be a high GI vegetable. But the consumption required to make that an issue is absolutely ridiculous. Like if you look at glycemic index research, it's done on 50 grams of carbohydrates from any one given food in isolation compared to 50 grams of table sugar. Like a carrot's 5% carbs. You got to get a kilo of that shit in to test that. Like that's not even contextually possible in the real world.
Well, that's the thing with fruits and vegetables, right? You get this huge fiber load with your glucose. So it kind of offsets that a little bit. But do you find that what Will's talking about with the with this, I guess, increase in insulin, tending towards more fat storage, or is that something that you work around?
So like I think if you wanted to do this accurately, you could test these measures and you can determine whether or not insulin resistance is starting to show its head by looking at biofeedback. So first point of call would be to do AM fasted blood glucose readings. and you would build a passport on like, what is your standardized range of fasted blood glucose levels? And then how does that trend and change over time? So like to look at a typical trend, for example, if somebody typically gets into an overreach period of training, you'll almost always see fasted blood glucose rise, because you can think about the fact that systemic stress is rising. Therefore, you've got high levels of cortisol floating around, and you'll typically get a higher pooling of blood glucose. And then you'll deload them, and then it'll go back to normal. So it's a stress-induced increase in basal blood glucose, not necessarily from a change in food. The food may not have changed. It's actually more of a physiological stress response. Then you could look at postprandial blood glucose to determine whether or not there's a sensitivity issue. Like, how long does it take you to get blood glucose back down into a fasted range post consuming a certain amount of carbohydrates? So you could look at like a 2 to 3 hour blood glucose test. So like, for example, I'll use myself just as an anecdote. My AM blood glucose sits a little higher than what you would typically expect it to. It sits at like 5.2 to 5.4, but it almost never changes. But if I eat 100 grams of carbohydrates, within 3 hours, I'm under 5. So like my sensitivity to carbohydrates is super high. So I don't have an insulin resistance issue. I actually am quite insulin sensitive. Just for whatever reason, my basal glucose sits a little bit higher. But then almost always I overreach, my blood glucose goes up, and then I deload and it comes back down. But there'll always be a point though, and you'll see this with guys, as carbohydrates escalate to a point whereby now the quantity of carbohydrates exceeds the storage capacity of muscle glycogen and the output in which you're putting the body through, that you'll get a little bit of a tip over and a pool into the blood then, because there's almost, you can't keep up with the storage capacity of it. And then we'd have to say, like, do you need that level of carbohydrates so to continue pushing? If it's someone like me who's trying to escalate weight right up here, maybe. So maybe now you need some support to sort of take the stress off the pancreas from an exogenous point of view. Or it might be that individual then needs to just stabilize for a little bit, because they don't, if they're natural, like how many calories do you really need to drive growth? It's not that much. Yep. So there'll be a point where you just stop, push, hit maintenance, titrate back down, re-escalate back up. But the short answer is I don't typically see it, to be perfectly honest. Like, we are made as humans to utilize glucose extremely effectively. Most people, like of any kind of size, like you're storing somewhere in the vicinity of at least 400 plus grams of carbs inside muscle. You've got 50 plus inside your liver. Most people aren't consuming that high carbohydrates, and that's assuming that you burn none throughout the day. So like, you've got a fairly big reservoir to push them into.
I would argue though, in that particularly just like in the cardio school, obviously your aerobic system is your life quote system. Mm-hmm. That's what we utilize 90% of the time. I would say metabolically, a lot of our regular life though isn't glycolytic. We're not pushing intensities. Most of life is spent really in lipolysis as opposed to glycolysis. We're burning fats most of the day. So my sort of intuition has always been to gear more towards fats, knowing that, one, I want metabolic flexibility, but two, carbohydrate drives a given role in performance, just like you said with fats, where you go, okay, fats are there to satisfy a purpose. I sort of think the same with carbs. Otherwise, they're sort of a risky macronutrient, I would think, in that if you've got adequate glycogen storage, you can only perform it. Once your glycogen's full, in theory, you can only perform so hard. More carbs won't make you train harder, right? You can only store it and utilize it so much. Above and beyond that, and when you're trying to drive calories and get really heavy, if you're on 5, 6, 7,000 calories, at some point you're going to have to lean on the fats and drive those. Otherwise, we'll all go really high in protein, I guess. But I don't know. I would argue that fats would be more of a life relevant macro to drive calories up with. Am I a bit out of school on that one? What are your thoughts?
Well, my question would be why do you need to get those fats from food?
Well, where else? You mean supplementally versus nutritionally? What do you mean?
What about adipose tissue? What about intramuscular triglycerides? Like, why can't your body pull from an already extremely large reservoir to facilitate that physiological function?
Not from a functional perspective. I'm more saying, like, if you're in a surplus. So let's say you're on a, we're trying to push you into a calorie surplus, and you've got enough carbohydrate to satisfy demands. You're training. Let's say an average bro is training, doing 5-6 days a week. 1 hour weight session.
I train 8 days a week, Will.
Oh, yeah. That's my boy, Stu. I'm training 95 days a week. So let's say we're doing our daily session, and you guys up to, if you're people on, 5, 6, 7, 800 grams of carbohydrate, I'm just like, it's just not that intensive. It's just not that glycolytic. You're not going to burn that fuel. And I'm like, if you try to increase calories and you've sort of got enough there, the risk of spillover on those guys versus fats, I don't know. I sort of just would think, a sensible way to increase calories when you need to would be either protein or fat would be where I would go to. But do you find is there another reason, like outside of satisfying glycogen and so on as a macro? Do you see in a real world, because you have a lot of athletes, does that happen? Like, do you find that people tend to lean towards that fat gain a bit with the carbs in a higher calorie setting, or do you lean on fat?
I can say anecdotally for myself that I don't grow without huge carb loads. So I don't grow like protein. To me, like I don't know on a biochemical level or on a biological level why this happens for me, but I can increase my protein significantly and see really no extra benefit in growth. Whereas if I significantly increase my carbohydrate, I can grow masses of extra muscle tissue. Obviously, the protein's still there, but and I can show this in my DEXA scan results. As we incrementally increase carbohydrates, I can increase muscle mass, significantly. So I'm not sure exactly what the connection is there and why, but I know for me, my secret growth tool is brown rice. Like I grow like a weed on it. It's just like if I want to really put on some muscle, like if you said to me, Stu, you have to get on stage again in a year's time, my next meal would be a huge bowl of brown rice with maybe some chicken in it. But, for me personally, I grow really well when I have high carb loads.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So most of that carbohydrate quantity that you're looking at, Will, is coming from the necessity of calorie demand, right? So like we like most of the time, carbohydrates are only going to continue to escalate if calorie demand escalates. I think there's a huge misnomer in regards to people thinking that they need to constantly always be eating more food, or that they think that their surplus is not sufficient enough, and they drive that too high. So a lot of people, I think, over represent how much calories they need. But typically, what you're going to do is you're going to look at like what is your calorie demand based on your size and your output. How much protein do you need to facilitate the goal? It might be somewhere between 2 and 3 grams per kilogram. What is an efficient amount of fats? What is the reach amount? What's the preference amount? And then what's left over goes to carbohydrates. And then as energy demand goes up, because you're either driving more training volume or you're becoming a larger human, therefore you have capacity for storing more carbohydrates, the substrate that you should, in my opinion, use to continually facilitate that progression is carbohydrates, because it's most conducive to the goal. Your body, when it is sitting in this sort of relaxed state right now, parasympathetic, driving fat loss or driving fat use, you have an abundance of that from food, and you have an abundance of it from fatty acid adipose tissue available. There's no need to just swamp the system with more and more fats, And the interesting thing too is like the harder you train, the more metabolically flexible you become. You typically use more glycogen per unit of work, and then you get out of glycolytic phases quicker, which means you then tap into fat stores. So like you actually need more carbohydrates as an effective training individual anyway, because your utilization is far more effective, because you basically pull a whole bunch more ATP because you're really effective at creating energy.
Dean, sorry, I was just going to ask, do you think that this kind of, obviously fats were, I guess, public enemy number one up until, even relatively recently in the scope of things, it was like people thought that if you eat fat, you get fat. And so we avoided fats and we demonized them for a long time. Do you think that there's now been a switch sometimes too far the other way, where people now romanticize fats and almost give them more credence than they're due? And, I guess you've got things like keto and Atkins and, all these sort of things that have become popular. And, people now tend to want to, I guess, shine this loving light on fats more so than they need to.
Yeah, man, like almost always the answer is somewhere in the middle. Almost always, man. Like I think anyone that completely omits an entire nutrient is likely falling to some form of dogmatic bias. You got people like fucking Paul Saladino at the moment trying to tell people that polyphenols cause cancer. Like, mate, no. Like the body of evidence suggests the absolute opposite. And just because you can pull 2 studies doesn't mean it's true. And the problem with like the carnivore you mentioned before too, man, is like there is no research to show the potential negatives of that, because it hasn't existed long enough for us to actually see it. So like the problem with the science argument then is like someone like, well, show me the science. Well, I can't, because it doesn't exist. But based on the current body of evidence, we can infer that there may be an increased risk for X, Y, and Z. But so like I don't really particularly. I'm not dogmatic in my carbohydrate approach. I would say that I'm preferential towards driving carbohydrates, but I'm almost always okay with also pushing fats up if the person has a preference for it. Because at the end of the day, like it's protein and calories is going to manage the majority of all of this stuff. For Gen Poppers, don't even worry about it. Just protein and calories. Like that has been proven time and time again. And if your calories sit somewhere in that range, fats and carbs shift around to dietary preference, you'll get the exact results you're looking for.
That's it. Well, that's what a lot of the young guys who come in and say, Stu, how do I grow? What's the secret? How do I get big? And I say, put more food in your mouth. Simple as
and train harder.
Yeah, train harder and eat more food. If you're creating progressive overload in the gym and you're in a caloric surplus, you must grow. There is no way not to if you're doing that. If you're in progressive overload and you're in caloric surplus, you must grow. And it's I guess it's simple, but it's not easy. And that's why not everyone can do it.
I will leave, and again, because we've had you for quite a while, so I'll try and wrap it up shortly. But one last sort of area I'd love to just angle it, because I think this will feed in quite nicely to your sort of more evidence-based angle. But nutrient timing. Now, this is a little rabbit hole that tends to, again, have a bit of glorification. And as earlier in the game, I actually fell down the rabbit hole quite a lot of looking right into, probably going too deep into it. But do you buy into the idea of do you just arrange your macros for your athletes overall and go, this is the calorie, this is roughly the value of the macros, and just arrange as you will? Or are you at the camp where you see a significant difference when you manipulate the timing of those macronutrients versus having them in a controlled environment? Like, so if you're isocaloric, if you've got everyone in the same calorie intake, if you manipulate timings versus not, do you believe there'll be a significant difference in your athletes? Or do you sort of just go, well, these are the numbers, calories in, calories out? See, what's your take home on nutrient timing with it?
You can't really look at it in a vacuum. That's the difficult thing. So like if you were to say they're all isocaloric, will you see a difference? Then the difference is like based on what? Like if they were all training exactly the same, they were all genetically the same, and then we're saying, would we see a difference in body composition? The answer is probably not, But if we then take into consideration that most research suggests that carbohydrates lumped in around training, especially if it's a sweep average during training, you'll almost always train better, then maybe those individuals might get that extra rep. They might get that extra kilo. And maybe in 2 years' time, they might have gained an extra 1 kilo of muscle mass. So like we can say again, like this is almost like I said back in the beginning, if you can, why not? So I think from a nutrient timing perspective, though, the importance of it escalates as calories decrease and the demands are retained. So like a comp prep, more and more important at the back end of comp prep to potentially partition your carbohydrates around the training window, because it will decrease the risk of muscle loss and increase the chance of performance enhancement. But that's only because your energy availability is diminished, because you're not eating as much food. You don't have as much reservoir of carbohydrates there. And then you're also psychologically beat up. So there's some benefits psychologically to have that sweet food potentially around training, or a little bit of carbohydrates prior. For the most part, I say to most people, here's your diet. I have a bit of probably a natural bias to tend to go slightly lower carbohydrate in the morning and then more carbohydrates around the training window, just because I'd rather drive, like Stu, you were talking before about having like a high GI food. Like post-workout food for me is almost going to always be like a yogurt in a cereal, a whey in a cereal, a bagel, something like super simple. And it's easy to get a lot of carbohydrates in those foods for a low stomach volume and still achieve a good fruit vegetable content. Whereas in the morning, like when you're taking less carbohydrates, pulling more carbohydrates out, you can still then get like more veggies in, for example. So just by nature of sort of trying to facilitate a sufficient amount of micronutrients in the diet, it kind of leans towards the more carbohydrates around the training window. If you're enhanced, it becomes less of an effect, unless of course you're trying to play God with fast timing of insulin and all the rest of it. Probably something that is, again, way too reductionist in thought process. Yeah, I would say there's potentially benefit, but the benefit goes up as the calorie limit goes down and the effort is retained in a prep.
Dean, you said that you're trying to grow at the moment. Are you making a comeback to the stage, mate?
Maybe no.
I said first, folks.
Probably. I competed at 89.9 last time.
Fuck, you look way.
That's
the
exact weight that I competed at. Last time I competed at the Arnold's.
Fuck, I would not have picked 89.9. You looked about at 105. That was
If I'm honest, I think I would have been genuinely probably like 92. But at about 4 weeks out, I found out that weigh-ins were between 4 and 6 p.m. And I was like, fuck, man, like I can't really afford to load that hard on that. So I'm going to try and deplete now. And I did like a mini deplete 4 weeks out and dropped 4 kilos. Like, again, like super sensitive to the response. And I didn't even go low, man. I went 150 carbs for those 4 days. And it was like, cool, dude. I just dropped 3.5 kilos. And I don't know if I ever got that fullness back.
What happens there? Why does that happen? Because I've found that too. If I'm dieting and I overreach, even for a very short period of time, I might not get my muscular fullness back again, and until I get in a period where I can have a 2 or 3 day breather with very low activity and drive some food back in. It doesn't make much sense though in terms of the chem. Like it doesn't really realistically. You've got a static carbohydrate consumption. Output returns to normal the next day, but still, I see that all the time. And you hear it people when they say they deplete, and people towards prep week do it all the time. They get too stringy and flat and wiry. And what is that? What do you put that down to?
Well, I mean, we don't have research on bodybuilders. We have research on endurance athletes, and the individual variability in the requirements for carbohydrate loads to sufficiently supercompensate post depletion starts at about 8 grams per kilogram and goes up to about 12 grams per kilogram of carbohydrates, and it's sometimes between 1 and 3 days. So if I go and deplete at 90 kilos and only put back in 300 grams of carbs for my low day, I'm still talking like I'm miles under, man. That's going to take weeks to get that shit back when I'm still training.
Right. Okay.
So even to throw this in, so after I did that deplete, I did a test load of 1,500 grams of carbs between 4 p.m. and 10 p.m. Because I thought that's what I'm going to have to do. So I tested it. I just walked around with a box of cereal.
I do the buckwheat pancakes.
Oh yeah, no, I haven't. Man, I made a lot of rice pudding with 99% fat-free condensed milk. I had cereal. I had a lot of noodles though because I got too much sweet food. I didn't play the palate game very well, and I just got sick. But anyway, so I think I would have been 92 is probably my sweet number. And then I said to someone like, if I'm competing again, I have to be heavier, which means I have to do under 100s. And I started that prep last time at about 105 in worse shape than I'm in now. And I figure like I'm going to have to be at least 110 for an extended period of time to see if that's comfortable. If it's comfortable and I can tolerate it, then I'll consider a diet. If it's not, then I'll just decide that that'll do me. And at the moment, I'm like 106.5 and I'm tolerating it pretty well. My coach, Joe, reckons I'll get to 115. So let's see what happens. If that's the case.
What's the heaviest you've ever seen on the scales? What's the biggest number, Dean?
108. That was like 30 weeks out last time, but it was just a food baby, man. It wasn't actual weight. Typically what I do is like, I train like hard, but not that frequently. Like when I'm not really focused, I just work. And then I'm like, I might compete. And it's usually about 30 weeks away. And then I go hard for 10 weeks. I eat a lot and try and put on as much as I can. And then I freak out about not being peeled enough. So then I just start dieting early. And then, so that's typically been my approach. Whereas this is the first 10 weeks that I've legitimately not missed the mark on food and everything. Like I've eaten the same diet every day, but 2 meals a week. And food's going up. Sups are in a good place. They're not high. And yeah, I'm the heaviest and leanest I've ever been. So who knows, man? It could be October or March.
Yeah.
That's exciting. Right. That's exciting.
And under 100s, we think.
Yeah.
That's a huge jump.
You wouldn't consider doing classic?
I can't make it.
No, nowhere near anymore.
Last year, I would have had to have got down to 86.5.
Oh,
or 2 years ago, sorry. 2 years ago.
So how tall are you, Dean?
175.
Okay, yeah. So
I just miss it by like a half a centimeter to a centimeter.
Mine, I can be up to 90 kilos for classic. So yeah, but it'll be interesting to see.
Not going to make it.
Just see how you look, mate. I'll be very interested to see.
A 10 kilo stage jump in 12 months, mate.
I don't know if I'll be 99, but if I could, I think if I could be somewhere in the sort of 95s, that would probably be one of my better looks. I think under 90, I'm just a little bit like still dieted down too much and not enough mass in the right places. Like I got beaten by Ariel because he's just a bit bigger, even though he's the same weight. Structurally just has that sort of look.
Yep.
Whereas this time, but then the thing is, man, like if James Newcomb competes, no one wins.
You don't. That's the other thing. So you never know who's. So we all know who the really exceptional bodybuilders are in this space, right? So you mentioned James, and there's a couple of others that come to mind. But then just every now and then, someone pops up on the scene, and you're like, "Who is that? Where do they come from? What gym do they train out of? How come no one's talking about this kid?" And just on the day, you never know where they're going to come from.
Yeah, man. I started a junior next week who's from Adelaide.
Yeah.
And he wanted to do classic, but he's 122 and he won't make it because he has to be like 98.
Yeah.
And I'm like, do you want to not grow for the next 12 months? He's like, fuck that. But the dude's got a beautiful physique, man. I'm like super excited about him. He'll be one of those people who are like, oh, who's that?
Yeah, where'd they come from? I always love it when I go to one of the shows and there is one of these people pop out of nowhere. It's an exciting thing because everyone's looking at him and everyone's talking about him. People go, who's that? Oh, I think he trains out of Perth somewhere. Oh no, I think he's out of North Queensland. And you're just like, who is this kid? Where do they come from? It's it's always exciting to see new faces on the bodybuilding scene, and I hope that we see more and more of that in the future. I hope that we see bodybuilding continue to grow and continue to progress in Australia. And, with things like, Flex success, we will.
Yeah, man. And so long as the practice continues to improve, I think there's no problem with it. I thoroughly enjoy it. So I'm not going anywhere. So as long as people still want to compete, I'll still be here.
Well, to that end, mate, I think, we got some amazing value out of that. And I think we could validate it quite nicely too in each particular rabbit hole we went down. So mate, thank you so much for coming on and giving us an hour and a half of your time. That flew by. It felt like it was only about 10 minutes, but we covered a lot of ground. I think our listeners are getting a lot of value out of that, mate. So for episode 23, thank you very much, Dean, for giving us so much of your time. We really appreciated you having on, mate.
My pleasure, and good luck trying to give this one a title.
Yeah, we covered literally everything in fitness.
We'll sort it. Don't worry. We've got I'm the wordsmith. I'll handle it.
Perfect.
No problems at all, guys. Well, thanks for listening and thanks for coming on board.
Cheers, mate.